Greetings, various assorted salutations. Welcome to another U.S. History lecture. Today we're going to be looking at labor in the Second American Industrial Revolution. For my students in class, this is probably a lecture for U.S. History 2, and this is looking at kind of the human side of the Industrial Revolution, whereas previously we were focusing more on innovation and technological developments. Laconically put, shortly put, factories built fortunes for a few but left millions of workers fighting for fair pay, safe conditions, and dignity. This was a difficult age. It was an impressive age of incredible innovation, but these things come at a cost, and somebody's paying it. Well, that's what we're looking at today. Our learning objectives are as follows. 1, we are going to describe the working conditions faced by industrial laborers in the late 19th century. 2, we're going to look at the rise of labor unions and major strikes during the Gilded Age. So like last time when we used the phrase Gilded Age, we were looking at kind of the gold plating of this era. The shiny innovation, the new ideas, the new technologies, all the excitement with that. Today we're peeling back that gold layer and seeing the rotten core beneath, I suppose. And number 3, we're going to analyze the struggles of workers and how that shaped a broader push for reform throughout the United States. Now there's a few key terms and definitions we're going to go over. First up is wage labor. Many of my students are familiar with wage labor because that might be what they do if they're working at fast food or maybe at a store. This is work for an hourly wage rather than land ownership or an independent business. You get paid a certain amount per hour and you get paid for the hours you work. That's the idea there. This is different from a salaried position where you have a contract outlining your duties and responsibilities and the time frame to do them. Teachers would be a good example of what you as a student would encounter of salaried employees. This is also different from commissioned workers. Commission, oversimplified, is you get paid per sale. Most people think of car salesmen, particularly used car salesmen, real estate agents, as those people who are paid for each item or thing they sell. They get a certain percentage of profit. Next term on here is child labor. Now, child labor is the employment of children. We see this in factories, mills, and mines in the Industrial Revolution. This is an unfortunate piece of the history of the Industrial Revolution, because child labor was seen as a solution to a workforce problem. Children of a young age were easier to complete tasks. They could be compelled to complete tasks more easily. Children were seen as kind of smaller, so mine shafts didn't have to be as big. They had good reflexes, so factory owners kind of had this mentality of, they can dodge the dangers of working in the factory. It was a very dangerous time for child labor. Also, children were paid less. That was another reason. Tenements, we'll talk more about those in a minute, but those were often overcrowded, and it was a housing solution in the big growing cities. There's 2 labor unions we're going to be looking at in this course, and for this unit. We're going to look at the Knights of Labor and the American Federation of Labor. We'll talk more about those in a bit. Labor unions are where workers come together, and part of the reason they come together is there's strength and unity, and there's kind of a safety in numbers idea. One of the things that unions do is collective bargaining, where the union negotiates with the factory or the workplace as opposed to the individual. And the idea is that an individual may be weak, but a group or a band is stronger and has more negotiating power. You're not speaking for one factory worker, you're speaking for all the workers on the shop floor. We'll talk more about strikes in a minute. And Labor Day is the last term. Now, Labor Day is a federal holiday honoring American workers. It was put in, and it's a day to celebrate labor and working by taking it off. It is worth noting that Labor Day nowadays is not as remembered as much for its labor part. Many Americans associate Labor Day as kind of the last hurrah of summer. There's people who like to take trips, barbecues, camping, picnics, that kind of thing, which I guess is celebrating time off. So maybe the original message isn't focused on but the intent is still carried out. Now, to understand why conditions are difficult and look at this rotten core, we need to look at the conditions. First off, the industrial work was dangerous. We're seeing factories that would have 12-hour work days, 6 days a week. The weekend is a relatively modern concept, and when you think about it. When you think of all the safety things in the world today, like guardrails, safety hats, safety glasses, aprons that protect against acid spills, steel-toe boots, all kinds of those things, the unfortunate thing that is kind of disturbing to think about is somebody, usually a lot of people, have had an accident where those things are justified as existing now. Somebody has taken a fall. Somebody's gotten clocked in the head. Somebody's had something hit their eyes. For every piece of safety equipment that you use in the modern world, somebody learned or experienced the hard way, and not everyone survived that experience. We also see low pay. Workers were very disposable. It was not unheard of for workers to be paid very low. Women and children were typically paid even less for the same tasks than men. And as a result, often within a family, as soon as the kid was old enough to work, you sent him to the factory or you sent him to the mine because you needed multiple incomes to sustain a family. And that was a challenge for a lot of people. I think this analogy is perfectly fitting. Humanity ignored, a person becomes a cog in the machine. Some factory owners really saw workers in the factory, especially the unskilled ones, as completely disposable, just like you would replace a machine. Many of the tasks on the assembly line were simplified to the point where, in theory, you could just show a person how to do it. And that person doing that task could be a child. It could be somebody who doesn't understand the language you're giving instructions in. Like many immigrants coming over did not know English, and they were in the process of learning it when they had time, which I don't know how much time you're going to have to learn something when you're working 6 days a week, almost all daylight hours. And so as a result, many unskilled laborers were just seen as like, oh, this one broke. Let's go get another one. Oh, well. Kind of an unfortunate truth of this era. Let's see here. To make things worse, there was a kind of a sciencey sounding description for why you could get away with treating people as pieces of machinery, and that was something called social Darwinism. Now, Darwin oversimplified. He came up with that survival of the fittest, finch. And essentially that argued in nature, animals that are not quote-unquote fit don't survive. And so what some people did with social Darwinism, especially the rich elites, is they would say rich people are the fittest to survive in this industrial society. Therefore, those who are too weak or too poor, basically the same thing in social Darwinism, they're not fit to survive. And social Darwinism would be used to look down on poor people. Social Darwinism would be used to justify horrible treatment of others. It's one of the key steps. If you want to do evil things, you often have to find a way to label the people you want to do evil to as something less than people. And social Darwinism was just kind of a way of science, using scientific sounding terms to justify horrible actions. But that's not all. We also have a lot of urban struggles as well. People are moving into these big cities. You can see the city street here. It is crowded. You've got people shopping. You've got carts all over the place. Traffic laws are not a thing here. It's crowded. There's balconies. There's people drying laundry. There's a lot going on. And these cities just keep growing and growing and growing. Workers often lived in these overcrowded buildings. We'll talk about them more in a second. And cities had really bad sanitation problems. In the 1800s, a lot of places didn't really have sewer lines or designated trash services. So people would dump trash, they'd have put in outhouses, and these could run the risk like throw trash out in the street or throw it in the lot behind the apartment. And this trash and this human waste could contaminate groundwater and contaminate drinking water. And so that meant these cities were often very unhealthy. You have the pollution from the smog of the factories, you have pollution from the trains, but you also have pollution from contaminated drinking water and poor waste disposal habits. The example I like to give is cholera. Cholera is a nasty disease. There's many symptoms to it, but one of the parts of it is dysentery and dehydration. And if you don't address dehydration, you can die of thirst. Well, the problem is the way you treat dehydration is you drink water. The water has cholera in it. So many of these diseases could get worse. Now, this is an age of innovation, so it was figured out what causes cholera. Cholera was caused by contaminated drinking water, contaminated water when you're washing fruits and vegetables. And so doctors figured out, oh, well, we can figure out where cholera is by looking at where people get their water from. And in these big cities, the apartments didn't really have running water, and so how people got water is they took their bucket down to a street corner with a water pump. And so everybody who used that water pump and got cholera is probably coming from that water pump, or the water coming from that pump. And, well, the example I give kind of in class is you could put a sign on there that says, warning, contains cholera, do not use for drinking or washing of foods. The problem is not everyone can read English, or not everybody understands all the words on the sign. And so some people might not know what that sign says. Some people might think that sign says the water's special. Information is not as readily available. People may not be able to know what cholera even means. There's another example of a doctor who removed the water pump from a contaminated water thing, and it turned out that the people of that area fixed the pump. Just because you can't read or you don't understand a sign doesn't mean you can't do mechanical stuff and fix something. I think he finally got them to quit drinking the contaminated water by dumping a bunch of concrete on it and bricking it off. Turned out none of these guys had jackhammers. But you can see how these cities are going to be chaotic. There's lots of people. New people are coming in all the time. There's things in place. There's things going on. And you may not understand all the parts. Like a fire escape should be kept clear. Well, you can explain that to somebody, but not everybody immediately understands or immediately acknowledges that it's urgent. So like some people use fire escapes as like storage space. So when the building catches fire, it's harder to evacuate. There's many examples of this. But we'll talk more about the immigration elements in a future activity. But we have tenement housing, which is a response to the housing crisis. And tenement housings are basically cheap apartment buildings thrown up as quickly and cheaply as possible. The earliest ones didn't have running water. They didn't have bathrooms. You put an outhouse in the back, I guess. And when they did have those things, they might have like one bathroom for like every 100 people. And when I say like one bathroom, I mean like one sink, one toilet, one shower. Here's a bit of a grainy picture of one. And these apartments were cramped because one of the ways to run rent down was the rent of a apartment might be at a fixed rate. So the more people you put into it, the cheaper the rent becomes. It's like this picture of a tenement house apartment has 1, 2, 3, there's 4 down at the bottom and there's 2 up top. So there's at least 6 people in this picture. Take the rent, divide it by 6. It's cheaper than dividing it by 3. Or 2, or 1. These tenement houses were dangerous, they were cramped, they were crowded, and they were great for spreading disease as well. Here's another picture. They were also built very close together, so if one collapsed or caught fire, it was often very likely you could lose a whole block. You can kind of see there is a yard between them, but for hanging clotheslines, and that might have been where people put trash. You also see in the foreground of the picture there's a railroad track, and that's because in this town, to try and mitigate some of the pollution, they put trains on elevated tracks. So a steam engine would be on a kind of a bridge throughout the city about 20 feet in the air or so. This meant that it was blowing smoke higher up, but sometimes the soot would drop, and the trains on these bridges made a ton of noise. So big cities were crowded, noisy, dangerous as well. There's also a great deal of crime. I mean, a lot of people like to talk about the Wild West and how dangerous it was, but you were more likely to die in an industrial accident or die in something going wrong in a big city in many cases. There's also a great deal of poverty as well, because when you have people living paycheck to paycheck and you can get fired for like being sick or getting injured, you were like minutes away from disaster. Many people were. And for criminal purposes, these big cities, you could walk down the street and not know a single person. And that not knowing anyone can kind of create a sense of, well, I don't know these people. And as I said before, one of the ways you can do evil against others is you don't consider them people. You find a different label for them. So, really, the big cities of the Industrial Revolution grew not because they were having more children, not because they were any of that. Instead, it was more people showed up, moved in, than were dying. And so people came in, and that's kind of a scary way of succeeding. We're not succeeding because things are necessarily getting better. We're succeeding because people keep showing up. But now this leads us to the response to some of the working conditions. The city improvement conditions, that's a separate topic, but we're focusing on kind of the work and the world that these people are living in. But labor unions are going to emerge. Individuals can be silenced, but a group of people is a bit harder to, silence. Labor union, here's a term. It's a trade or a labor unit, and it's referred to usually just as a union. It's an organization for workers, and that organization works to improve the conditions and maintain things for the employees, like improve how life is going. They might do things like advocate for less hours, better pay, better safety standards, for example. Some of the tactics unions have. One of the things they could do is they could organize strikes. A strike is where the factory workers refuse to work, and this is a great negotiation tactic because factories only make money when they're producing something. If a factory sits idle, it takes a certain amount of money to maintain the machinery, pay the rent on the lands, pay the taxes. And if that factory sits idle, the company loses money and they could go out of business if this goes on long enough. Boycotts are from the other end, whereas a strike is ceasing work. A boycott is rejecting the product a company provides. And boycotts are an effective way because the company can make all they want, but if they can't sell it, they won't make money and they can't keep going. And the unions will do boycotts and strikes to force workplaces to negotiate. We also see lobbying as another tactic. Lobbying, which you hear more about in your government classes, is where your organization tries to convince lawmakers to make laws that improve conditions, whether it's safety standards, holding big businesses accountable for violating the law, things of that nature. Sometimes another union has a similar goal to you, so you might form an alliance. And also unions will support the workers during strikes. Because even if you're not, remember, many of these workers are wage laborers. They only get paid when they're working, the time they're working. And so unions will often use like membership fees to buy groceries, keep the rent going, pay the rent. Because strikes are more likely to work the longer they can run. Let's see here. Some famous unions, just to talk about them. We'll look at these more in detail in class. But the Knights of Labor is one of the earliest ones. They were famous for a number of broad reforms that they pushed for. They wanted an 8-hour workday. They looked for things like equal pay, banning child labor. Due to an incident called the Haymarket Affair or the Haymarket Square Riot, the American public kind of grew afraid of them and their membership declined. The AFL is a group that was focused on skilled workers. They tried to improve pay, hours, and they were founded/led by a man by the name of Samuel Gompers. Skilled workers are different from unskilled workers. We've been mainly talking about unskilled labor up to this point. Skilled workers they have a talent or a training or a skill that you can't just pull someone off the street and expect them to have. In a mine, an example of a skilled worker might be the engineer, or whatever the position is called, of someone who maps out the mine, like where do we dig next, so that the mine doesn't collapse in on itself. A demolitions expert, the guy who works with TNT, things like that. That'd be an example there. In a factory, skilled laborers might be the person who maintenances and keeps the machines running. Somebody's got to keep all this equipment up and running. Yeah, just a couple examples there. The Industrial Revolution is maybe not necessarily one of war, but there is a lot of violence and there is a lot of conflict. Definitely a lot of that. Factory owners really could, there's a lot a factory worker could get away with, factory owner could get away with. If a factory owner didn't like somebody complaining about working conditions, fire them. There are very few worker protections in place, and so workers could lose their job by having the wrong opinion according to their boss. This could be handled through like blacklisting employees. Blacklisting is where like an employer will tell other companies, hey, don't hire this person. They're part of the union, or don't hire this person. They complained at my factory and caused a lot of problems. You don't want that at your factory. So blacklisting was a very common tactic in this time period. You could threaten to cut workers' pay. If the workers went on strike, there was a thing called strike breaking. And what happens with strike breaking is you'd hire other workers to replace those who were on strike. This tactic worked pretty well in the Industrial Revolution because there were a lot of people who needed work. Immigrants coming in, people leaving the farm. There was a constant flow of people coming into these big cities. And so you could probably find somebody who they just need money to get a roof over their head. And so strike breakers were common. Violence was also another issue. A number of workers who caused problems or asked the wrong questions or made the wrong complaints, they could be disappeared. There were some rough, violent men who could be hired out to do violent things to people. That's the simplest way of putting it. There are some notable events. The Haymarket Square riot we'll look at in more detail in the coming days in class. The Homestead strike is another one. This is where steel workers, using the Bessemer process to make steel, they were trying to campaign for better worker rights, and Carnegie, I've heard different pronunciations of his name in the same documentary sometimes. Their factory owner, Andrew Carnegie, he hired private militia, and they compelled the strikers, with the threat of violence, amongst other things, to get back to work. The Pullman strike is probably one of the biggest ones. This happened in 1894-ish. And what happened is railroad workers went on strike. And this was a huge issue. If you remember from the previous lecture, what happened there is railroad are part of the transportation, one of the four things you need for an industrial revolution. And so when the railroads stop, everything kind of comes to a stop. Factories can't gather raw materials or move finished goods out. You can't transport passengers. A lot of things. The federal government will intervene, and this is a vast oversimplification of events. The federal government intervenes, I believe, under the explanation of the railroads are too important to our economy, and we need to keep the mail moving, the U.S. Postal Service moving, and it uses the railroads. But the Pullman strike was forcibly ended by the government, and the government dragged the factory, the railroad owners, and the union reps into a meeting and said, you guys need to sort this out, or else. But There are still labor unions today throughout the United States covering a variety of industries. I won't go into too much detail about them because this is U.S. history too. We're studying the Industrial Revolution. But a few notable ones are the FL-CIO, Federal American Federation of Labor, and Congress of Industrial Organizations. That's a union with unions in it, like it's a wider organization. The Teamsters are another famous one. They started in trucking, advocating for the workers of trucking industry, and have expanded since then. Logistics, that kind of thing. We've got the United Food and Commercial Workers, who represent grocery store, meat packing, food processing plants, things like that. United Auto Workers, pretty self-explanatory who they represent. The largest, at time of recording, the largest union in the United States is the National Education Association, which is the union for teachers. In the coming days of the course, we'll be taking a deeper look into some of the things I've introduced here. But that's enough for now. Until later.